Okay, we're live. And we already have a comment. Matt says, "Welcome back. How's the tour?" Well, I haven't left yet. I'm not going to be on tour until June 4th. I guess we did it wasn't really a tour. We just did some dates in Texas that we can leave Austin and come right back. So, we went to like Bryan and San Antonio and did record release shows there. So that was a lot of fun. We're doing a kickoff show on the 30th and then we're leaving. So yeah, first time going to the Western US with this band. Not in general. I've been it's going to be brutally hot here in Texas, and out there it'll still be warm, but it'll be like nice. It'll be like a normal summer, like real summer, like people are supposed to have, not this, boiling frog situation that we have down here in Texas. So anyway, thank you everybody for joining me. Hopefully more people will shuffle in, but the great thing about these live streams on YouTube is that they save it. So if you miss the beginning, you can always go back and watch it again. Let me know in the chat if how my level sounds, if you need more volume, or if there's any issues. Because this is a one-man operation, so I'm going to rely on you, my viewers, to be my producers. So I called this an Übermodernist stream, and I want to talk today about Übermodernism. And that's a bit tongue-in-cheek, but it is a serious idea that I want to launch in a way. Everybody, has to have their own ism at some point, right? And it's almost, I put this forward with no expectation that people are going to call themselves uber modernists or that this will be some actual movement, but it's a new way that I want to put forward of thinking about where we are in terms of modernity and modern theories of metaphysics, morality, truth, those kinds of things. And what I mean by this, or what I think the need is to coin the term Übermodernism, is quite simply that postmodernism as a term has too much baggage now. Postmodernism, you could argue Nietzsche begins the project of postmodernism in several important ways. For one, Nietzsche believes that all thinking is suffused with willing. So on the one hand, there's no such thing as willing in the proper sense without thought and interpretation. And we've talked about this many times in the podcast, how every drive has its own form of logic, something like that. That your reasoning is, the conscious rationalizations that you have about what's going on in your life and what you're doing and what your character is and who you are is actually an emergent property of the thinking of a bunch of different drives. And when we say thinking, what we really mean is a sort of evaluation, an evaluative judgment that every drive makes, every impulse makes, that you could say happens even at the level of perception. As Nietzsche says, even our perceptual systems have a value judgment involved with them, for the simple fact that you sense certain things and not others. And the example I've always used that Nietzsche brought up in his notes is that we don't sense the electrical field, right? So there was a series of organic value judgments that allowed us to sense light particles, photons, and to have like an olfactory sense, and to have, this nervous system where we can, all these sensations, but we never gain the ability to sense the electrical field, right? And so even our perception of reality is based on the notion, or it's based on the underlying foundation of, in Darwinian terms, it would be what is survivable. Nietzsche would say it's more will to power, flourishing, what your ability to push yourself out beyond yourself, create yourself anew. But whatever the case may be, that there's a valuation at the basis of even our perceptions. The other side of that coin, though, is that thinking, if there's no willing without thinking, there's no thinking without willing either. And Nietzsche sounds this note continually throughout the beginning of Beyond Good and Evil. The idea that every act of thinking, even abstract philosophical thinking, is ultimately the rarefaction, the representation of some drives evaluative judgment, yet again. That there is no, this is what Nietzsche means when he's saying there is no dispassionate reason, there is no detached intellectualism. You can look at Kant's critique of reason and his categorical imperative and his phenomena noumenal split, and you can think that that's all these were purely rational concerns of a sovereign, arbitrarily governing intellect. But Nietzsche's counter narrative is that no, that's not actually what's going on, that we can find a psychological basis for everything that Kant said, even these like incredibly complex ideas that you would never source to like being a psychological motivation. And he does the same thing with Spinoza, he does the same thing with Descartes, he does the same thing with Schopenhauer. And so thinking is suffused with willing, which means thinking is based on whatever's rational is also based on a pre-rational value judgment. And pre-rational means non-rational in a very important way. And so this is why Nietzsche will say that our conscious world is a surface and sign world, that it reveals something but conceals even more, that our conceptual reasoning is an indication, a symptom of what's going on unconsciously. This doesn't mean that there's no power to the concept. In fact, you could say the concept is a key part of willing as well. You could say that in every act of willing, there's a representation going on. And I do mean representation in the German idealist sense. An example that we could use might be that, let's say you have the will to get a nice fancy sports car. Now, do you will for are you just willing for the object as it is? Or do you have some representation in your head, some image of what you will be, yourself driving the sports car and how it makes you more attractive to the opposite sex or cool in front of your friends? It's some sort of self-image or something like that. It's a very vulgar example. But the idea would be that in every act of willing, we're making some representation of ourselves in the future, of some new thing that we can become, right? But that's an intellectual process. That is an idealization. That is the faculty of imagination. That's using your rational. I mean, you could argue that that's the function of rationality, right? Is to calculate from where you are to where you want to be. That in the animal kingdom, that this would simply refer to, how do I find the best hunting ground, the best place to gather fruit and, make shelter and all of these things, have a fresh water source. How do I calculate from here to there in a literal sort of navigational sense? But we use it for all sorts of things that are far, far beyond that and far, far more complex. And so Nietzsche's argument is that this even applies to abstract philosophy. Now, so as I've said, postmodernism, the postmodernists take a lot of these ideas from Nietzsche. I don't mean that in like a negative way, like they take influence from him. You could also say there's like three things in modernity, or really four movements in modernity, that we can find the origin in Nietzsche. You could say existentialism. Nietzsche helps build that along with Kierkegaard as a precursor. Nietzsche's always a precursor. He's not the one who says, I'm the one creating, these new movements. Well, sometimes he does. Because the second one, you could say psychoanalysis, psychology. Nietzsche does say we need to be psychological. We need to be psychologists. Psychology is the route to the fundamental questions. Another one is the linguistic critique of philosophy that becomes incredibly important with Wittgenstein. And a lot of that does have to do with Nietzsche's idea that language is a surface and sign world. We could also look at his aphorism, the genius of the species, and his whole idea that communicability, the idea that language, like the word concept always refers to what other people mean by the concept. that language is the realm of communicability, kind of hews to the lowest common denominator of what can be understood by the most people. There's no private language, and the more private your language gets, the less useful it is, the less communicable it is. And then the fourth thing would be postmodernism itself, the deconstruction of the, we might say, the morality or the aims behind a text, seeing the person behind the text. And you can see sort of all of these things that Nietzsche is a precursor to are kind of all contained in postmodernism in a way, because it contains that psychologizing aspect, looking at the psychology of who's saying it, consider the source. You could also look at it as, the linguistic critique is a huge part of it. In any case, when people think of postmodernism, though, who do they think of? They generally don't think of Nietzsche. They think of Derrida. They think of, I guess, Foucault would be part of the postmodernist tradition. You could say Spivak is a big one. And they become very concerned with this whole critique of meta-narratives, which is not something that's necessarily in Nietzsche. He doesn't use that language, at least, that he's critiquing meta-narratives. In fact, Nietzsche provides meta-narratives of his own. Nietzsche doesn't have the pretense of standing at a view from nowhere, critiquing all the meta-narratives and leaving us with none. In a way, he thinks it's the return to the understanding, really a sophist understanding, that your philosophy is an expression of who you are and your perspective necessarily. For him, this is not a demand that we have no perspective. It's quite the opposite. It's demand that, therefore, articulate your perspective, right? Live your perspective. Give your perspective the most beautiful, persuasive voice you can give it. That would be the sophist tradition. And that's often been the critique of postmodernism, is that they don't actually deconstruct their own meta-narrative. They oftentimes, as Jordan Peterson points out, were Marxists. And so they did have a meta-narrative. And that has been sort of the IDW critique of postmodernism. And that's really where we're at with how most people who are not familiar with the postmodernist tradition tend to see it. The postmodernists are just out there to deconstruct everything, make everything relative, subjective, make everything, just human all too human. There's no universal, eternal, objective truths, no universal, eternal, objective morality, and therefore, there's no God, everything's permissible, right? That's what they take from the Nietzschean death of God. And yet, at the end of the day, there's like a Marxist, what is the Derrida's famous quote that what fascinated him about postmodernism was a certain spirit of Marxism, that in the same way that the Marxist wishes to abolish private property, the postmodernist wished to abolish our intellectual property. And by the way, there is a very interesting etymological connection between the word reality and realty. And this is something that it gets distinguished in English common law in the 1500s. Before this time, realty, which comes to us through the French, and which comes through Latin, which comes eventually, you can trace it back to an Indo-European root. The word that we use, reality, to refer to what is real, what actually exists, has a distant Indo-European root in property, goods, wealth. And this goes all the way through to the Latin res, which also, there's a way in which saying that something really exists, it has like the quality of existence, the property of existence. I think there's something with that in the word. But when we get to the term realty, which comes into English through the French, it briefly had both meanings of indicating what actually exists and property, real property. And they made that distinction in English common law between personal property and real property. Personal property was like movable property that you can pick up and move around. Real property was fixed, immovable, like set in the earth, right? And so then they began to use realty for that meaning exclusively. And this new word reality is born when we separated the abstract meaning of what actually exists from landed property. Now, why is it that what actually exists, reality, comes from realty, landed property? Well, there's something about drawing a line, setting boundary stones, setting a property line in the earth, and carving that off and saying, this is a parcel of land, that can be seen as very similar to the creation of the word concept. If everything is really a Heraclitean flux, if we go with that idea for a second, and by the way, even Peterson has acknowledged this. He refers to the frame problem of AI scientists, right? Which I don't know to what degree that's actually been solved, but the idea that it's very hard to designate where an object begins and ends in objective terms, because again, you can look at something and our perceptual systems are shaped by those evaluative judgments, right? So I look at this pen and I don't see particles. I don't see which it is. And I don't necessarily look at all the individual qualities of it in order to check in my brain what that is. I just see a pen. That's the first thing I see, is just this individual object. But really, it's made up of various objects. It's not one thing, right? I can take it apart. I can deconstruct it. And that's true of so many things. Is this one notebook? I mean, is it still the same notebook if I rip pages out of it? What if I replace it with pages? Ship of Theseus, right? So there's all these sort of problems with designating what an object is in the flux. And the Greeks knew this with the fact that they were talking about the ship of Theseus so long ago, points to that very issue. And so this whole issue with so anyway, realty and reality. There is something about creating the concept, like laying claim to some real property in your intellect, that is a similar kind of operation to just drawing a property line. You sort of draw an arbitrary boundary that you've appropriated. We still use that language in intellectual terms when you say you grasp an idea, you take hold of it. It becomes yours, it becomes your real property, right? It becomes part of your intellectual wealth, the things that you have. That's what your understanding of the real is you think you've laid hands on something in the flux that is just becoming, and attributed to it fixity. You've you could say there's that passage in Nietzsche, Recapitulation, in The Will to Power, that Heidegger quotes all the time, which is to stamp becoming with the character of being. That is the highest activity of the will to power, the peak of the meditation. And so that's what our intellect does. It stamps becoming with the character of being. Whatever appears to have the greatest perdurance, fixity, we attribute with reality. We lay hold of it in that way and say this is a constant, this is a fixed thing. So in any case, where I'm going with all of this, so do you go back to the postmodernists? There is a spirit of Marxism in the sense that they're abolishing intellectual property. They're abolishing your real property when they critique the meta-narrative of the text, when they deconstruct it, when they attack whatever meaning that you thought was fixed, that appeared to be fixed and eternal, an eternal truth. Well, they abolish that in the same way that Marx says we have to abolish private property in the material sense. So, in any case, postmodernism, insofar as that is their point, they do have a real point. I think insofar as where they're lacking is when they deny the value judgment at the basis of all perception and at the basis of all conception, in themselves, right? In their own task, to whatever extent they did that. And I would say, if anyone's out there who are a big fan of the postmodernists, they'll probably argue that they don't do that. That they are like Nietzsche, articulating their own perspective, aware of its contingency, something like that. And like Sartre saying, well, we all have our hands dirty, so it's something we have to engage in, even though there's no objective grounding for it. But in any case, it is tied with this political movement. That's just simply the reality. When people think of postmodernism, they're thinking of that kind of orientation. They're thinking of that kind of like left-wing revolutionary struggle against meaning, truth, something like that. And I think we need to go back to Nietzsche as the proto-postmodernist and leap over all of the postmodern baggage that's been created over the 20th century and go back to that original critique of what consciousness is, the fact that its mentation is suffused with willing, that there's a psychological basis, a perspective behind every view, and realize that it can't be tied to any specific perspective. It can't be tied to the Marxist perspective any more than it can be tied to Nietzsche's perspective, which ironically is kind of setting up this new theory of Übermodernism as a kind of eternal truth. Like, right, you could say, is that universal? That it's all from everyone's perspective. And I would simply say yes, right? That is the consequence of viewing the world as will to power. That if thinking is willing, there's an element of will to power in thinking. And that would be true of every thinker. And so I like the name Übermodernism because, yeah, we are going back, but it's like Nietzsche says, you take a few steps back for a great leap. Sometimes you go backward in order to leap forward. And Über means over, above, beyond, or, it has that idea of Selbstüberwindung, of self-overcoming, that it's not just that we're postmodern in the sense of being after modernism. We're actually overcoming modernism. To be offensively Hegelian, you could even say we're sublating modernism. And so what is modernism? I mean, modernism is the modernist theory of truth, the idea that statements correspond to some sort of objective reality, and the more objectively your statement corresponds to that reality, the truer it is, something like that. And I don't think I need to go over why Nietzsche would disagree with that statement. I pretty much went over it at the beginning of the video, but that's precisely what we're overcoming. And so it can't be Nietzsche's project, which many have called postmodern, can't be bound up with any of these other thinkers' projects, like contaminated with their perspectives, or even with Nietzsche's perspective. What he's giving us, the tools that he's giving us to think about thinking, you can be seized on by anyone, can be appropriated by any force. And that's what Übermodernism is. It's a new toolkit in that way. And all right, so that's my introduction. I've been talking for about like 25 minutes. I think what we're going to do now is I'm going to open it up to some questions. If you already asked a question, I don't really want to scroll through everything that's already been asked. So, okay, here we go. Do you have any thoughts on Bataille? That's going to be covered next season. I do not feel comfortable speaking about Bataille publicly yet. I don't feel I have enough intelligent things to say. So, like I like some of what I've read. It's a bit difficult. But yeah, we're definitely going to talk about Bataille next season, as well as Pierre Klazowski. Those are the two that are for sure. What's coming up in the immediate future is Heidegger, and then Horkheimer and Adorno. And we're also going to talk about a lecture that Nietzsche gave. That I guess I won't tell you. I'll leave that one a surprise for now, and then there will be 2 final episodes on Eric Heller. So let's see. Could you compare and contrast a great man by Nietzsche standards versus a great man in one of Ayn Rand's novels like Howard Rourke? Yeah, it's pretty easy. I mean, Nietzsche, he doesn't have that Randian respect for the businessman. He doesn't share Rand's. I mean, Rand is an objectivist. So that's a big difference between Nietzsche and Rand. She actually does believe there are these universal objective principles of reason. And in that way, there's something very, I don't want to say democratic about Ayn Rand, but let me reference Horkheimer and Adorno when they're speaking about science, which they speak about science, or technology more properly, is knowledge as power. And they point out that knowledge has always had an aspect of power contained within it. And what they say is that technology is no less democratic than the economic system that birthed it, which is mercantile capitalism. Now, is mercantile capitalism democratic? It is and it isn't. So technology is and isn't more or less democratic, or like it is and isn't democratic in that same way. You could say meritocracy might be one term, and that's sort of the analogy that I'm drawing to Rand. But the idea is that no claim of blood or no sort of claim of destiny or fate or anything like that gives you more of an ability to harness science and technology for your own ends. The kings do not control it any more than the entrepreneur who discovers a technological innovation gets to lay claim on it for all time, in spite of what our intellectual property laws may attempt to do. And so, in that, Rand has this whole very capitalist notion of sort of creative destruction and the meritocratic opportunities of the market. But basically, what I'm trying to get at here is like Rand's not an egalitarian, but she has this notion that anyone could sort of, if they apply themselves, if they live freely, they live according to rational self-interest, which anyone in the Socratic sense, in the theoretical sense, could recognize what's in their rational self-interest if they applied themselves. And anyone could rise from the level of worker to CEO, and I think Nietzsche would see the same thing, and he would say that's bad. Nietzsche does want there to be like a distance between the aristocracy and the ordinary people. Now, obviously, back in the ancient Greek times, that was literally like an aristocracy of blood. I don't think it necessarily would have to be that in the modern age. I think one of the things that's very interesting when we study old aristocracies is that they had selection pressures on them that modern aristocrats don't have. The example I've often cited is in Peter Turchin's work, where he talks about how a Roman aristocrat during the civil wars had a way higher chance of dying than a plebeian soldier. They were the aristocrats led from the front. Their value set made dying for patria the most glorious thing that you could do. And so this pruned the elite, but it also made them, like, it shaped them. Those conditions turned them, like, the Spartan elite was very different from our modern business elite. So say what you will about that, but that's like it's a very different kind of great man who can, meritocratically work really hard, harness technology, even use modern things like lawfare or guile through business practices and so on and so forth to sort of like climb the ladder and make themselves a great man. But what are they doing? What are they like? What is the nature of their greatness? It's in the capitalist system. It's satisfying desires. And I think in a very important way, Nietzsche he doesn't see quite the same distinction that many have made between capitalism and socialism and all of our modern systems, that they're all based on this utilitarian notion of reducing suffering and satisfying desires for humanity, for the greatest possible number. And both capitalism and socialism make the claim that they're the system that can do that. And funnily enough, neither one has ever existed in a pure form. They've always existed together. There is no pure capitalism. There's no pure socialism. It's sort of like where Nietzsche says, as if you could distill all of the thinking from willing, and then the will would remain over. No, you can't. If you were to take all the socialism out of the system, capitalism wouldn't remain over, and vice versa. They depend on one another. You need a state that can mint currency and enforce that currency and regulate the market and prevent fraud in that market. And on the other hand, like the idea, whenever you try to have a purely centrally planned economy that doesn't have the dynamism of markets, it becomes stagnant and eventually fails in that sense. It lacks the element of becoming and dynamism that's just needed to advance humanity. It's like a system of stasis and trying to direct things from a central rational governing body. So yeah, I think Ayn Rand, her whole objectivist idea of like anyone being able to like apply their rational self-interest, everyone having opportunity and all of that, the great man being the businessman. Nietzsche would have a huge problem with all of that. And I think the other thing is that Nietzsche's not really an individualist. He says it himself that he's not aimed at an individualist philosophy. Now, in the existentialist sense, does Nietzsche, like I read Nietzsche as an individualist in many ways. I'm doing that. You could say I'm just appropriating Nietzsche for my own ends. And that's fine. Of course, that's what I'm doing, right? But Nietzsche himself is not necessarily aimed at that. He doesn't think most people are individuals or even can be. This isn't a Nietzsche quote; it's a Jung quote. But Jung has that great passage in Undiscovered Self where he says, where he's sort of talking about, he's actually talking about collectivism, but he says the problem is that we have no individuals, and 1,000 zeros don't add up to a one, no matter how many zeros you stack together. That's the condition of most people. Is that, I mean, frankly, they're NPCs, right? And most people are like the individuality. The vast majority of people I look at and I see a type. I see these eternally recurring types all around me, even among our great men. Every once in a while, like there's a unique or an unparalleled individual who's actually finds themselves in a role where they can change society or something like that. But Nietzsche would say that that's like 1 in 10 million people, maybe more. So that would be my contrast. Scrolling through. You got my message on Uwana? No, I did not. What are your thoughts on reconciling Nietzsche and Jung? Will to power versus archetypes and the collective unconscious? I mean, there's really no possibility of reconciling Nietzsche with Jung because the archetype for Jung refers back to an eternal value, or at least so long-standing, like so biologically instantiated in us that it might as well, for all intents and purposes, be eternal. The collective unconscious, this shared property of mankind, so it's universal, right? That's one. The values that are in us. It's eternal, or closest thing to it, for all practical intents and purposes. And even though the archetypes have all of these sort of different faces to them, and they express different things, and they do, you could say that the individual's experience with his archetypes and his dreams, or like how they come out in his daily life, is going to be affected by who and what he is and all of these things. At the end of the day, they're the same set of basic components within the self, Jung would say, that therefore they're consistent, right? So there's something uncomfortably platonic about Jung's archetypes and the collective unconscious that I think Nietzsche would say actually within the unconsciousness of the individual is where you find the most unique things about them. That's where they have the most that is peculiar to them. That the best things about an individual, their passions, their virtues, will almost be uncommunicable because we might not even have general words or terms for describing what their passions or virtues are, or like to really understand like what are the virtues of a man like Goethe. You kind of have to read whole books by Goethe and read his conversations with Eckermann, and then you can start to like describe who he is, right? But just making statements in these general terms, these virtues, like that he was a, he was a romantic, and he was at the same time classical. We can make all these generalizations, but you don't really understand it, right? You don't really know a person um, by these generalizations, these abstractions. They're all abstractions. Literally, to abstract something is to take a quality, like this pen is black, and abstract the quality of blackness from it and say that also applies to this microphone, right? And that's like a thing. That's a noun now. It's not an adjective, right? And that's kind of what we do with virtues is we're abstracting qualities from people and then making them into like, I don't know, in again into some sort of platonic idea of what that is, but that always again cleaves to the lowest common denominator and not to what is unique and individual in that person. And I think Nietzsche would say that he would be very skeptical that there is this collective content in the unconsciousness. I'm sure he would say that it's there to some extent. I just don't think he would. For one, I don't think he would say that it's the source of our values necessarily. And I think he would believe that there's much more that is, again, unique and unparalleled in the individual. And Jung, of course, attempts to return us to Christianity and to religious values that he thinks are like biologically instantiated within us. And Nietzsche would say that those religious values are relatively recent in human history. That the project of civilization, I believe he uses the term like the 6,000 years with which we're more or less familiar. That's when there's been this big change in the human animal, in the psyche, right? I think Nietzsche is actually far more commensurate with Freud in many ways, even as Freud tried to distance himself and had some, everyone knows about Freud's wacky theories. But nevertheless, I think, there's a lot more respect for Jung in online philosophy and online sort of like people who would like to delve into psychology and psychoanalysis. And there's a lot more combination of Nietzsche and Jung. And I've certainly spent a lot of time talking about Jung because Jung is one of the most interesting thinkers who's ever lived, frankly. And I find him more interesting than Freud. But as like a scientific representation of Nietzsche, Freud is far closer. And I don't know that Jung can, at the end of the day, be reconciled with Nietzsche, which is why Jung tries to basically say that Nietzsche's a madman. And Nietzsche would say that Jung recapitulates to Platonism. So that's how it goes. Thoughts on Heidegger's conception of will to power? You're going to have to wait. You're going to have to wait because I've got 3 episodes coming on Heidegger. And 2 of them are on Heidegger's conception of will to power. One on will to power as art, the other on will to power as knowledge and metaphysics. So I'm not going to get into that here. Do you prefer Deleuze or Heidegger's interpretation of Nietzsche? Why? They both have their merits. I would say that Heidegger is actually Heidegger uses language to describe Nietzsche. The way he labels Nietzsche is almost at times seems designed to be language that Nietzsche himself would hate or reject, calling Nietzsche a metaphysician, saying that what is being is the central question of Nietzsche's philosophy. But if you look at what Heidegger's actually saying, like, okay, he makes that statement, then you can read paragraphs and paragraphs of him explaining what he means. And he's actually very faithful to Nietzsche. He actually tries to very faithfully interpret him. Deleuze is a bit more creative. Now, I think Deleuze's understanding of ressentiment as like as a neurological system, or not a system, his understanding of ressentiment as it plays out psychologically, and his understanding of the master and slave morality and active and reactive as something going on in the conscious, is this interaction between the conscious and unconscious apparatus. That is incredibly valuable. I still think it's a little creative. I don't know if it's what Nietzsche intended. I think Nietzsche did probably intend the master and slave morality to refer to a real political dynamic, a real social dynamic that produces these different moral outlooks on the world. But there's a real sense in which that reflects a certain psychological reality that Deleuze hones in on and points out very astutely that to be a slave moralist, you don't need to have been dominated in a literal way, that it doesn't refer to a literal slave revolt in morality. It refers to an inferior function in the brain, the consciousness, overthrowing uh, drive and impulse and separating the self, the drives, plural, from what they can do. That the reactive forces within the self triumph without amassing a greater force. And that technically consciousness should be a regulating and reactive, like when it's in its reactive role, not separating the active force from what it can do, there is a useful functionality to consciousness that's not pathological. It becomes pathological when the reactive forces go on top and begin to separate the active forces from what they can do. And so that he makes the slave revolt in morality into a psychological event, which I think it is. And I think he's correct about that. But other things that he says, I mean, the example I always go to is like the eternal return. Like Heidegger's reading of eternal return is way more faithful than Deleuze. As far as which one is more useful, I think Deleuze is more useful to read. I think more Nietzscheans should probably read Deleuze before they read like Heidegger's lectures on Nietzsche. That will open up new vistas of interpretation for you in a way that Heidegger, I think, one of the things I was struck by in reading Heidegger's For You, in a way that Heidegger, I think, one of the things I was struck by in reading Heidegger's material on Nietzsche is how much of it was not very innovative, which in a way is good. I'm like, well, I've said the same thing before on the podcast as he's saying here in this passage. And I'm like, what do I really say about it? Right. He's not really adding anything new. In a way, that's a compliment to him, because you could say I'm not adding anything new because I'm speaking about Nietzsche 80 years after Heidegger. But I came to my interpretations of Nietzsche independently of Heidegger, and I ended up aligning with him a lot more. But in a way, like he didn't open up like too many new ideas of Nietzsche interpretation for me, because I feel like we're kind of on the same level. So that's like kind of how I feel about it. Thoughts on Brian Johnson and his new religion, Don't Die. People want to preserve themselves. The only value in modernity is self-preservation. So yeah, is that really a new religion? Does that link us to each other, relink us to each other socially? I mean, you could say that the whole "don't die" ethos, like, what was the name of that movie? I think it had like Justin Timberlake in it, where it's like you can extend your life indefinitely. Like people pay in time, like they have a certain amount of time that they have left in their lives, and like that's like the currency. And you know, like a lot of that movie is about how that it becomes like a very that's not like the basis of a social like bonding or culture or anything like that. That's like the main thing that religion is supposed to give us. I mean, I guess uh, for a lot of you, maybe religion is to help you solve your existential crises, and maybe that's what Don't Die does. But I don't know. I don't really have many thoughts on that. I kind of lost my place here, so I'm just going to skip through. Sorry if I'm skipping your question. There's more questions than I can answer in like the couple hour period of time, or a couple hours of time that I'm going to be doing this live stream. So somebody says mic cracking. Oh, it's choppy. Damn. Oh well. Is it still choppy? Let me know. I don't know. I guess I need to keep talking for you guys to tell me whether the mic's choppy. I wonder, did it sound like it's like a connection issue, or does it sound like it's a problem with the microphone? Okay, it's probably a connection issue. Well, hopefully that was temporary. Hopefully it was like the first time that really happened. Okay. Can you briefly explain the concept of will according to Schopenhauer and Nietzsche? Um, yeah, I mean, will for Schopenhauer is monistic. It's one thing that's behind everything. All phenomena are actually will. I mean, he gets there from saying that. So Kant's thing in itself, right? We can't make any statements about. We can't cognize the noumenon. We only know the phenomenal world. So in Kant's critique, one of the things that he says about our perceptions of the phenomenal world is that all of these, the principle of sufficient reason, right? The basis of our being able to reason about the phenomenal world at all involves these a priori judgments about it that include things like causality in time and space. And this is a way of sort of salvaging these fundamental axiomatic um, notions that we have about reality without which reason would not be possible, while still acknowledging that we don't know them through reason, we don't know them through induction. But the implication of this is that the noumenon is timeless and spaceless and acausal. And Schopenhauer takes that seriously and says, and so when he looks within himself as both an object in the world and a perceiver that can see his own inner content or perceive his own inner content, what he finds within himself at the very root is will. And so he says, will is everything, and will is therefore timeless and spaceless. And therefore it's one thing, quote unquote. In a way, it's not one thing, because if it was one thing, that would mean, like, it's not even one, because that would, like, you can't understand the concept of one without having many or something like that. But in a, in a very basic sense, it is just one thing, right? And so behind every object that exists, including living things, there is a drive to exist, to continue existing. That's what will to live is. And that is as much in this object as it is in me, right? And human beings are a higher gradation of the will. We go from like these lower, like, forces that are just kind of blind strivings. So gravity is just like a will, it's like the lowest form of will, up through rocks and plants and fungi and insects, to us, these representing, conceptualizing beings. For Nietzsche, that's not what will is. It's not behind the world. It's not one thing either. Uh, Zarathustra makes some very funny comments that he says, I laugh at your free will and your unfree will. There is no will. Nietzsche also says in his notes, to those who know, there is no will. He also says, Schopenhauer took the most primordial prejudice, which we could state as straightforwardly as possible, all things are full of gods, that everything that happens in nature is the result of a will. Here, analogizing from the conscious intention of a person to, it was the will of the gods why the village flooded. It was a conscious intentionality akin to that of a person. That was a will. Nietzsche says Schopenhauer just capitulates to that. And in doing so, he treats the will as the most basic thing in the world, the most self-evident thing. But as Nietzsche says, a philosopher of the future will say, the will at any rate is no immediate certainty for me. It seems to contain many things. The will seems to be a term we apply to muscular sensations, towards a drive to something or away from something, to passions, feelings, affects, and indeed thinking and interpretation and thought. And all of these things are called will. And so he says the will is a complex. And behind that word, a popular prejudice lurks. What is that popular prejudice? That the will is one thing and it's a magically effective force, and that we've explained something by saying, it was willed. That's how I did it. I willed it. Nietzsche says we explain nothing thereby. So what Nietzsche tries to do is actually make the will more complicated. And it's not will to power, it's wills to power. Will to power, in Heidegger's reading, what to power means, that appendage, is actually not just taking Schopenhauer's will to live and directing it at power. What Nietzsche is saying is that the very structure of willing is will to power. That what it means to will is will to power. What does that mean? It means willing is pushing yourself out beyond yourself and at the same time gathering yourself and recreating yourself in the manner we talked about at the beginning of the episode. And therefore, will is not one thing, and power is not one thing. What those both refer to is it's never pre-established. It's always established on the basis of a relation. And so that would be the thing for Schopenhauer. Will is eternal. For Nietzsche, will is relational. It's relative. There's quite a bit, just like with postmodernism. There's, and I'm done answering your question. That's my answer. But as another thought, like with postmodernism, there's quite a bit of what would you say? Glib dismissal of relativism from people who don't seem to understand what relativism means. So, even to say that you're hot or you're cold is a relative statement, right? It's not an absolute statement. You're referring to where, like, a sensation, which is a relative sensation, like how your nervous system feels in regards to temperature, is affected by what temperature you're in versus the change to a new temperature. When we say we're cold, we're not referring to absolute zero, right? Anyone who experienced that would be dead. And what's cold to somebody from Scandinavia is not going to be cold sorry, let me do it in reverse. What's cold to someone here in Texas is not typically cold to someone in Scandinavia, and vice versa. So even these words are relative terms, and that's true of pretty much every binary term or every term on these two poles. There's a lot of this in the Lao Tzu and the Tao Te Ching. There's a lot of this in Heraclitus as well. So relativism is not, people try to portray it like when you make something relative, you're saying it's like subjective whim. That's not what it is. It's saying that in order to establish what we're talking about, it has to relate to something else, right? And like to establish hot, you have to have a notion of cold, or like you have to have like some sort of like what your equilibrium is, and on the basis of that change, on that relationship between the two, it becomes sensible to talk about these things. So relativism, I think, gets a bad rap. Okay, where are we here? Okay, Jason Reza Giorgiani is our contemporary American philosopher. Okay. Now I'm curious if you think it is possible to use meditation to enhance will to power, or is it just a tool to apply logic of the will of Schopenhauer? What do you mean enhance will to power? What does that mean? I have no idea what that means. Like what? Like enhance your gumption, your go-getter attitude? Some people probably have that experience of meditation. Some people just need to, eat right and exercise and get a good night's sleep. Let's see. What do you think of language meaning as a high-dimensional, geometric, and self-similar network? Is the system of meaning as we communicate it not bound by geometry? Doesn't that break postmodernism? I don't see how it's bound by geometry. What are you, a Pythagorean? I don't think language. So meaning, the meaning that's conveyed in language is, again, relative. It's relational, right? There's no private language. And the meaning of a statement is going to ultimately refer back to representations that you've made based on perceptual systems that have made an evaluative judgment, which cannot itself be established by reason. Like, is that geometric? Where does geometry fit into this? That Nietzsche says that to construe the world in terms of numbers and formulas is a falsification of the world. Okay. Will you do Camus soon? Maybe. I haven't really thought about Camus. I don't really get many requests for Camus. I don't know. I'm not particularly interested in Camus. Is anyone interested in Camus? I mean, like, what should I read? Just like do an episode on The Stranger or something? I don't know. To merely survive without meaning is criminal. All right. Throw the nihilists in jail. So good to see you. Thanks for everything. Thank you. Finally finished A Secret History so I could make it through your spectacular analysis. I love The Secret History. I'm so glad people are reading it because of the channel. It's like, it's one of those things that I could only do really at the phase of the podcast we're in, where it's like, all right, now we're talking about like fiction that's been inspired by Nietzsche, but it's like, I don't know. I think it's a really Nietzschean novel, and it opens with a quote from Nietzsche. So, I know it's a super basic question, but what would be the best book by Nietzsche to start? I'm going to talk about this soon. I have, I've got a video planned on this basically because people ask me about that all the time. Of like, where should I begin? I would say, I'm going to go into it with a little more complexity in the video. The gay science, or like if you want to just like read one book by Nietzsche, that's probably the best one to start, and maybe skip the poems at the beginning. It's not really necessary. Beyond Good and Evil, if you've read a lot of other philosophy, might be a good place to start. Or if you're willing to like go slowly, look up words you don't know and ideas you don't know, references to philosophers you're not familiar with. Those would be good places to start. On the Use and Abuse of History for Life is a shorter essay. It's not going to have any of Nietzsche's major ideas, but I think it's actually a great introduction to Nietzsche. I wouldn't really recommend any of the other untimely meditations at the beginning, but Use and Abuse of History for Life is a great introduction. Drinking some coffee. Nietzsche actually said you shouldn't drink coffee. But it's funny because Nietzsche also said that all of our physiologies are different, and we should abolish the idea of having one standard of health, one diet, one series of recommendations for what fosters health, one normal course of illness, something like that. So it's funny, people will be like, Nietzsche said, you know, he didn't drink alcohol and he didn't drink coffee. It's like, well, okay, I'm not him. Nietzsche's will conception. What is this? Conception of the will makes sense if you take Hume's bundle theory to consciousness, IMO. I agree. Is power energy? Will to overcome brings joy. Is that not to mean feeling resourced? Yeah, I mean, you could see power as energy. You could see power as, you could say, actually, no, I would say energy is power and not the other way around. Because power is also, just when I was talking about how will is multiple, power also contains energeia. It also contains intellecheia. It also contains dynamis. These are all Greek terms, but the power to make things and affect changes, the power to be the one affected, to personally change. What is indicated by power, again, is never pre-established. So energy is a form of power, but power might also involve, like, I'm trying to think of a good example that doesn't involve energy. I mean, yeah, you can always like try and like make it in terms of energy, I guess, because all life forms have energy and rely on energy in order to do anything. But you could also say that like an obese person takes in a lot of potential energy, but they don't do anything with it, and it just kind of like, it kind of degenerates their physical form and their ability to do anything. So if you don't use it, you lose it. That's a very real principle, right? So actually, by expending energy, you can get more power, which I don't know. I would say power is power, and it takes infinite forms according to the one willing and what is willed. And trying to put it into some other terms, one of the silliest things in that Abigail Thorne video is when she said that it should be translated as will to freedom or will to agency. It's like, no, it shouldn't. Where are you getting that? I've heard multiple leftists say that. I think it's because they're just uncomfortable with power being the end of, like, any, like, and here I mean end in the sense of like means to an end, power being the end of anything. They're just uncomfortable with that idea because they've learned that power is bad. But I think there's no basis for a lot of these other translations. Let's see. How did Nietzsche impact your own personal life aside from this channel? So many ways. I mean, I don't know. I guess you could say in some ways Nietzsche, I gravitate towards Nietzsche because of who I am already, of what my personality is. And so, did he change me, or did things ring true in Nietzsche that I was going to believe anyway? Like I didn't start living my crazy artistic lifestyle that, where I kind of secede from the whole like capitalist system of the modern world. The whole vision of man as homo economicus would be a better way to put it. And deciding not to live for any of those incentives, I started on that path before I had read Nietzsche, but before I was a disciple of Nietzsche's. So in a way, he just kind of like reinforced things that I already knew. Right? It's always the philosophy we adopt is always post hoc, isn't it? It's always a rationalization for what we already wanted to do. Okay. God, I lost my place again. Okay, wait. Let's scroll up. I'll orient my place in the chat by Wanker Spanker's comment because it has the big red at. What do you think of backshots? Okay. Let's see. Oh, Uwana is a YouTuber that does long form vids and talks about art in relation to identity and politics, particularly socialism and communism. Her views on art might resonate with yours in some respects. Okay, I'll check that out. I'm Philosophy of aesthetics is really the only topic that I'm like serious about, like philosophically. Everything else that I talk about, like political philosophy, ethics, metaphysics, epistemology, all of that, I really approach as more of, I think of myself as an amateur philologist rather than a philosopher. I'm studying the past ideas of others, like, or maybe historian of ideas. I don't know, something like that. I'm really doing history of philosophy and trying to give you a authentic reading of what that perspective is. I'm trying to articulate other perspectives. Wear the mask of excuse me, wear the mask of Nietzsche or Heidegger or Schopenhauer for a given episode and try and articulate the world, make you see the world through their eyes. And but when it comes to aesthetics, I actually have like opinions and positions. And it's just funny because that's like the branch of philosophy that no one cares about. Reality is bound by geometry self-evidently. No, geometry is bound by reality is actually the see, it's funny, that whole discourse I did on reality at the beginning, it's like your entire concept of what exists, what is real is a representation in your head based on valuations that you've made. And one of those is geometry. And without geometry, man could not live. True. Doesn't mean reality is bound by it. Like, you don't have any basis for making that claim. It's like, geometry might as well be God in that sentence. Okay. Thoughts can be a storm. Meditation calms the storm. That's true. I mean, if you're like that, if you're like Stevie Nicks and you've always been a storm, as she sings, then that might be very useful for you. But not everyone's like that. Meditators tend to have this like evangelistic quality where they think that everyone needs meditation and everyone has the same thought patterns and pathologies and difficulties with thinking that they do. And no, everyone's different. There's some people who have ADHD and they can't sit and meditate. It's just not going to work for them. And there are some people who will take to that like a fish to water. And there are some people who really need to meditate who don't, and vice versa. There are some people who probably don't need to meditate and waste a bunch of time doing it. I feel like I was in that category. Your views on Spangler? I haven't really read much Spangler. I know he, you know, he's one of the thinkers that's brought up with the good times create weak men create bad times create strong men create good times. That whole meme, which I think Spengler gets credit for, but I don't think he's like he's not the originator of the idea. So from my understanding, Spengler believes that our current civilization, the Faustian man, our current society, we've already gone past the eras of like art and philosophy. Like we're in an era of science and technology. You shouldn't be a poet, be an engineer, right? All of the art has been done. It's like Hollingdale says about Goethe's poems, like they exhausted the German language. Like all of our civilization has exhausted its artistic energy, and now it's time to throw ourselves into the new thing, which is technology. And I don't know. I don't. That's not how I live. I definitely just from that perspective, maybe you can be like, well, that's stupid romanticism to keep trying to live an artistic life or a philosophical life today. But I think it's manifestly the best way of life for me. I don't know. There's too much like collectivist determinism, I think, in Spengler. Even though I have promoted like Turchin's theories on this and the idea that there is this cyclical movement to history. I don't think it's determinative over what you should do with your individual life to the same way that Spengler thinks it is. Okay, let's see here. Do Schelling. That's very, very unlikely. If given the opportunity to ask Nietzsche 3 questions, one for his early period, one for his middle period, one for his late, what would you ask? Which would be the most important to you? I don't know about that one. I would probably... The questions I would ask Nietzsche would probably be very different from the ones that most of you would ask. I would be more interested in like his personal life, I guess. Maybe in the middle period, I would ask him like, what really happened with Lou Salome? Like, give me the real scoop on that. Like, is he bound? Is this like something like a genie has like manifested Nietzsche in front of me and he has to answer truthfully or something like that? Because I wouldn't expect that he would answer me truthfully on that account. But I kind of want to know the real scoop. And with the early period, I'd kind of want to know some of the detail. I would ask him actually in the early period about the Bayreuth Festival. I would just ask him to regale me about 1876 in Bayreuth. He would probably be like, I had a horrible time, but I don't know. I just want to know what it was like, like, and in the later period, I don't know. I might have a more philosophical question about the relationship between his postmodern leanings or Übermodernist leanings versus the revaluation of values and kind of squaring that circle. So yeah. Do you think Nietzsche's attack on Christianity was short-sighted since he was mainly dealing with German Protestantism? I wonder what his opinion would be on orthodoxy. See, I don't think he was mainly dealing with German Protestantism. People often say that about Nietzsche. It's like, oh, he was responding to the Lutherans. It's funny because you can actually find quite a bit of Lutheranism like as an influence in Nietzsche's own philosophy. So it's kind of hard. And I don't think he had animosity towards German, like Lutherans as people. I think if you look at the comments he makes about the church during the Renaissance period, it's not clear to me that he would be a fan of orthodoxy. Like, it's not that his problem is just with Protestantism. It's the fact that Protestantism represented this turn towards like rational coherence in the doctrine and the elimination of all sort of like mediation or reconciliation with what is human in the church, and sort of like the fact that the church had bent towards, I mean, in so many words, had like functionally embraced paganism during the Renaissance. This is Nietzsche's view. In reality, it's way more complicated than this, but in so many words, functionally embraced paganism, even though the trappings, the aesthetics were still Christian. It was like a Christian shell or vessel outwardly in which the real content was pagan. Can you say that about the Orthodox Church? I don't really think so, right? Really, what his allegiance is to is Hellenism. And the problem with Protestantism isn't is that it destroyed. He says, he calls Lutheranism the Reformation was the storm that they only needed one more night before the harvest could bloom of the infusion of Hellenism into European civilization, and Lutheranism destroyed it. So that's already kind of like over and done with, right? So it's not like in the modern age he has a specific problem with Lutheranism. He actually says the Catholic Church, it's not between Catholic and Protestant, because the Catholic Church actually adopted a militant, like a siege mentality against the Lutheran challenge, and they had to become more rationally coherent. And then you get Jesuitism, and you get all these things. And I mean, you could say even today, even our Catholics are Protestant, right? And that's probably what Nietzsche would say. And I don't know about the Orthodox. Like, are they still? I don't think that really applies to them. But they're certainly not Hellenist either. So I don't know. I have wondered that as well. He might say it's a it's a point for the Orthodox that they still speak Greek and not Latin. Okay. Do one on the myth of Sisyphus. Oh, by Camus. Okay. Yeah. That might not be a bad episode. Okay. I got into rock because of you. I feel metal is the black coffee of rock. Listening to techno has the same feel. Very repetitive, but similar to life in a good way. That's cool, man. It's kind of cool that I can get people into rock music in the modern age. Like rock, that means rock music's so uncool and so boomerist now that it's like can be rediscovered. Isn't that exciting that rock can be rediscovered? Even like when I was going to high school, nobody would say I wouldn't even have the opportunity to introduce someone to rock. Granted, the rock music we were playing and we were into when I was in high school was very different from the rock music of the 70s and all that. But, it was like indie rock and the Strokes and Radiohead and punk, greasy punk rock stuff. But it's just cool to me that like I could introduce someone to rock, that it's like, it's not listened to as much anymore. Okay, let's see here. I started from Thus Spoke Zarathustra and didn't regret it one bit. Yeah, that's like you get an achievement, Xbox Live achievement or something like that. You get like a little badge for that. Started on hard mode, on insane mode. Or what was the Duke Nukem? Like, what was it, like Psycho? Or like, what was like the maximum difficulty? You didn't really understand my question about meaning being geometry. Yes, you're right. I did not. I'll state it like this and maybe you'll answer. How do you square physics with the postmodernism? Well, I mean, again, physics is the study of the phenomenal world. Physics is empirical. So you're studying, like we're studying what is effectively a pixel, right? Not literally, but like when you see an object, like you're not seeing the direct object. You're having an experience in your nervous system that's being represented to your brain. And human beings as a whole seem to have a series of experiences which are consistent with one another, which implies there's we could say like a human perspective, right? So in the sense that the way we talked about earlier, like your five senses, we don't sense the electrical field now directly. Now, as you would point out, in physics, we can detect the electrical field, right? But this raises the question, are there not more potential phenomena? I mean, they're not really phenomena if they're not perceived, but more potential forces so like we have light particles that we can see directly. Then we have the electrical field that we can create tools to detect. Is there another force that we can't create a tool to detect, that we wouldn't be able to detect in any sense? And could that force still be real, right? That's really the reality. And like, even with the things that, again, like I said, like we're not saying like no postmodernist or Übermodernist is saying that, like when you drop an object, it doesn't fall at 9.8 meters per second squared. would just say that like that perception of that is something that we all share. That's a relative perception to where we are in existence. The fact that we're not existing on the level of the subatomic particle or like on the massive scale of black holes or something. Like we live in this middle world, and we have a certain series of perceptions that are common to all human beings, or most human beings, if their mental faculties or sensations are working. None of that gets you any closer to objective truths about the world. You still have to make, you still have to draw these arbitrary lines around certain objects and designate that as separate from everything else, even though what physics tells us is actually it's not separate from everything else. You can't just take one object, one phenomena, and abstract it from the rest of the reality of which it's a part. Can you? I mean, this is the Buddhist doctrine of dependent origination. I mean, this is a real issue. Like, you can't just say it's like cause and effect. You say this, A caused B, caused C, caused D. It's like, well, why did you start at A? There were an infinite number of causes before that. Well, it's because at a certain point, we have a finite a field of attention, and we have a finite ability to like comprehend concepts or calculate in time or calculate in space or conceive of or represent things. And we just have to stop arbitrarily at a certain point. That's not based on the objective truth. It's based on what's useful for us. And that's why Nietzsche actually doesn't make a distinction between science and like his project. Like, he's not saying there's that passage in The Gay Science called "Long Live Physics," in contrast to metaphysics. What Nietzsche would say is physics isn't the thing that's giving us these notions of Platonic forms. Metaphysics is giving us that. That's not in your immediate perception. That's the mediation of reality through a concept. Okay. Somebody gave me a super chat. They said Georges Bataille with Nietzsche. I agree. We will, as I said, I will talk about Bataille. It's not really a question, but let's do another super chat. What relation does mathematics have to the objective truth? Well, that's again the thing, is that Nietzsche would say there is no objective truth because you don't know the object in itself. The truth is the kind of error that we find to be indispensable for life. Truth is the kind of error that gives us the most power. So every representation of reality that we make from our own perspective is not an absolute. It's a relative conception, something that we generate standing from a certain vantage point based on the perceptual equipment we have, and so on and so forth. But again, you never get to like the object, the thing with substance, the thing in itself. That's what these theories of truth, of objective truth, always end up referring to, as the thing in itself, which is, again, that's a metaphysical concern. Now, to the extent that mathematics is seen as, again, if mathematics is seen as an indispensable tool for understanding and dividing up the world and abstracting qualities or turning them into quantities, quantizing the world for the sake of power. That's why we believe in mathematics, by the way. It's not because it's never revealed, it's never torn away the veil of Maya and showed us the reality as it really is. What it shows us is how to manipulate reality. What it shows us is it gives us power. That's why we like mathematics. That's why we study mathematics. That's why governments fund mathematics, that kind of research and everything. So mathematics doesn't have to do with objective truth. Nothing has to do with objective truth. Is a spook. It's not real. It's fiction. We made it up. Is the name Essential Salts an alchemical thing? No, it's the name of a song by the Egyptian-themed death metal band Nile. It's about these necromancers in ancient Giza. This is like based on like H.P. Lovecraft universe stuff, where they interrogate, like they distill the essential salts of long dead people and reincarnate them. And he says in the song to like interrogate them about like, treasure hidden in the earth and ancient esoteric secrets. So that's where it comes from. I just really liked the song. Spilled some water. Okay. Oh, we have another super chat. He just says, great channel. Well, thank you, John. Empire Power #1. What are your thoughts on Milan Kundera? His novels are often inspired by Nietzsche's concepts. Never read him. Other people have brought up Kundera to me, I believe. If you think I should read one of his novels, let me know which one. What do you suggest including in an academic paper on Nietzsche's Overman? I mean, go to the source. Go to Thus Spoke Zarathustra. Like, look up all the times that Nietzsche brings up the Overman and look at his notes in Will to Power. That's where you're going to have the most material on the Overman. And I would just say the most important thing from my perspective is that Nietzsche never talks about becoming the Overman. To me, it's very clearly, he says the Overman shall be the meaning of the earth. So the Overman will be our new value. Now, the idea that the Overman will be a worldly, like will be actually a real person that actually lives, right? That there's actually a flesh and blood, a human end, telos to the human race, not something in an other world. That's very important. So I'm not trying to say, you shouldn't strive to become great or something like that. But this whole discourse about is so-and-so the Overman, or can I become the Overman or whatever? Your goal is to make that the meaning of the earth, to make your life, what Nietzsche says to bring forth the Overman is perish attempting the great and impossible. How many people actually do that, right? Be willing to throw away your life for some great goal. Somebody gave me 10 pounds from Yodo Gimi. Orb on the movements of the earth, intensely Nietzschean recent anime. It is good enough that I would recommend not dismissing it out of hand if you aren't interested in that sort of thing. Recommend. I'm not not interested in anime. I just haven't really watched it in a long time. I don't really have time to watch shows. I saw some chats. I think I skipped over about Berserk earlier. People are asking me. They're always asking me about Berserk, and so I'm like, I feel it's my fate. It's my destiny to eventually have to read Berserk and talk about it, but I don't know when. I'm not going to promise when. So maybe when I do that, I'll look into this show as well. That might be interesting. Okay. Let's see here. Is language unmoored from physics? This is the point here. I hear you, but this is my line of work. I'm well past accepting the inherent geometry of language and meaning. Is language unmoored from physics? Is physics unmoored from language? I don't know. I mean, the critique that Nietzsche makes in language, again, it doesn't really refer to the fact that there's no meaning in language. I think that's again another misnomer in postmodernism. It's not that it doesn't convey meaning. It's that there are value judgments at the basis of our conscious perception and representation. So there is meaning, but it's meaning always refers back to us in that way. And I don't know. I mean, would we have the same if we experience time at a radically different rate, or if we had radically longer or shorter lifespans, or if we existed there, if you were to take the human eye and you were to if you were to shrink a human being down to a really small size, you would get to a point where your eye wouldn't even be able to process light particles the same way. Even in full sunlight, to your eye at a certain tiny scale, it would be the full moon at night, that level of light, right? So there's just all these things where our organs and the way that we represent the world, it has really nothing to do with any kind of objective truth of the world. What you're trying to point to is mathematics that objective truth? Is there something, some sort of like anchoring eternal? I believe Quine made that point, that was sort of like a contradiction in the scientism of the modern age. Is like believing in mathematical laws and axioms like commits us to basically Platonic idealism yet again, and it's like looping back to a footnote to Plato. I don't know. We're probably boring everyone. This guy I'm going back and forth with on this topic over and over again, but I don't like. Again, I just want to make it clear. The point is not to like deny physics. It's physics would be mathematics, geometry would still be like the highest, like the most powerful kinds of truth claims you can make in many in a sense, but none of it rises above the level of error from Nietzsche's perspective. Okay, let's go to, if you know him, I would love an episode of timely reflections. Oh, you mean untimely, or are you saying this would be timely? Are you making a joke? No jokes. I'm just kidding. With Bronze Age pervert, it would be interesting to hear you and him talk about Nietzsche. Oh, like talk to him if you can reach him. Haha. Well, he follows me on Twitter, so presumably I could send him a message and be like, "Hey, Kostin, come on and talk about Nietzsche." I don't know. We'll see about that. It's possible. It's possible that one day I'll speak to him. People have asked me to do like an episode on selective breeding and the birth of philosophy, or on Bronze Age mindset, and I've kind of like resisted that idea because I'm like, he has his own podcast to talk about his interpretation of Nietzsche. When I'm talking about like the old books interpreting Nietzsche, like a lot of the time the person is dead. He is probably better at articulating the Bronze Age perspective than I am, because he actually wrote the book and he actually does a podcast on it to this day. So you can kind of hear that. A conversation with him, maybe. He does seem to be like a political actor. Like he's very concerned with current events. And maybe that's what you would say it would be a timely meditation. That's not really something I'm interested in. Maybe it could be interesting to have him on to talk about selective breeding and birth of philosophy. That might be an interesting idea. Another like, some people have pointed out, I've had like a lot of left wingers on recently in terms of like the political skewing of the people I talk to is normally tends to lean more left wing. But it's not really because I have a preference for that. It's part of it's just scheduling and how things work out, but it's also because, like Greg Sadler, if you follow his Twitter feed, he's obviously on the left, but the content that he makes is not concerned with modern politics at all. Like he was teaching a course on Stoicism at the time, and that's what I wanted to talk to him about. I didn't want to talk to him about any of my like modern political stuff. And like talking to Acid Horizon, they're obviously very deeply on the left, but we talked about Eraserhead and David Lynch. So it's not that I like have like any particular preference for like the kind of guest I'm going to talk to politically. But yeah, I've also thought about, I've wanted to talk to Yarvin for a long time because I think he's one of the more interesting political thinkers in the modern day, and he's become influential, arguably. So it's possible. I don't know. I would have to talk to him, and I do get a lot of people asking about it. I don't know how I would be in dialogue with him. Maybe I should go listen to Caribbean Rhythms and see kind of how he is with people. So yeah. Any of you have blah, 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 blah. Your channel literally changed my life and gave me the vision of a world that I can love. Thank you. Thank you so much, man. Thank you. I really appreciate that, hearing that from you. Let's see here. How can you say that we're not existing on multiple scales? Geometry. Oh, we're going back to this. We do exist on multiple scales. I'm saying our perception doesn't, right? Like you exist on a subatomic scale, but you don't see that. You don't perceive that. Okay. Let's go. Still looking through. In Thus Book Zarathustra, Nietzsche talks about equality people, calling them tarantula. Why that specific species? I think tarantula is like just a term for spider. I don't know if this has something to do with. I haven't really like looked into German and like if tarantula is being translated, like if that's used as a general term for a spider, it actually doesn't make sense with the analogy, is why I'm bringing this up. Like, because he talks about their webs, and to my knowledge, tarantulas do not make webs. They're a very benign species of spider that some people keep as pets because they're nice and fuzzy and they don't bite you. It's actually very interesting the way that they attack their prey. They like rip the hair off their back legs and throw it, and it has, it's like, I think to humans it's like mildly irritating to the skin, but to their prey it like kind of paralyzes them. So a lot of people find them cute and fuzzy. I don't know. In my copy of Philosophy in the Tragic Age of the Greeks, he refers to Parmenides as a spider many times and talks about his webs. And so there's this whole thing with web spinning in Nietzsche where he's talking about really like sort of like thinking in terms of these conceptual chains of syllogisms. And with Parmenides, for example, like he has like an axiomatic, it's not Nietzsche emphasizes it's not a religious faith. He has like a revelation of this axiom of being that to Parmenides, he's like, oh my God, what is, and what is not, and what is what is now and not what was or what will be, right? How can we say that there's non-existence? That doesn't make any sense. If there's no non-existence, then there can't be multiple things, because that would be, you would have separate things that then have non-existence between them. But if it's all just being, it would all just be one thing, and there would be no past, present, and future, because time would be an illusion, because you can't say that if something is, that it now isn't. Being doesn't become non-being. Like, there's just being. It's just, it is. That's the only truth, right? And so Nietzsche says, from that starting axiom that's like coldly logical, he builds this whole web that ends up denying the entire world. And that's why Aristotle, and Nietzsche agrees with him, says that Parmenides, his philosophy tied off the veins of empiricism. It actually, to Aristotle's mind, he ceased to even be a natural philosopher because he stopped trying to understand the world. And that was the thing about the pre-Socratics, that, as Nietzsche calls them, pre-Platonics. But in this sense, I do want to bring up the fact of pre-Socratics, because Socrates is very ethically focused. He's very focused on the human life and how people are to live and how society is going to be structured, and virtue. He's less concerned, Socrates, with determining the arche, with like the starting principle of how we understand what reality is. Socrates kind of tables that question and is just, like, in an important way he doesn't, because we get the Platonic theory of the forms, which can be seen as like a synthesis, right, of Parmenides with our senses, the sensory world, like in a way of like saying like, okay, the sensory world is like real, but it's less real than this intelligible world. Whereas Parmenides is just stuck in a purely intelligible world, and therefore has to like deny what he sees with his own eyes. And so, anyway, I'm getting off track here. The whole thing with web spinning, that's really what he's talking about, is like somebody like creating this whole web from the central point of like this axiom. And he says that Parmenides is like a bloodless web spinning spider, right? So to relate that to the preachers of equality, what Nietzsche is talking about there is actually, well, it relates to what we've been talking about with physics and perception and postmodernism and all these things. That when he's attacking the preachers of equality, there's this metaphysical attack that's going on that's beneath the social or the political implications of the idea of equalizing unequal things, of confounding non-identical things under the same label or the same term. And this would be the way, by the way, in which language is not circumscribed by geometry in the way that you're talking about it, because linguistic terms can have contradictory meanings that refer to the same terminology, or they can even refer to, like, you can have a concept like, and this is getting maybe a little dialectical, but again, I've just been reading Dialectic of Enlightenment. So enlightenment is myth, and myth is enlightenment, is the claim that Adorno and Horkheimer make, right? What do they mean by that? Well, they're saying like it was always the power of knowledge that drove this process forward. And enlightenment in itself like was already contained in myth. The myths were like an early form of attempting to understand the world so that we can control it. That all of these early myths have this idea of, man being in the image of God in the same way, or the gods, Zeus, the way that Zeus hands the people who rule their cities the ability to be just, or Yahweh makes Adam and Eve, gives them dominion over the animals and the earth. And myth was like the first way of like trying to, it's like myth takes you beyond the flux of just immediate sensation and begins to name phenomena in the world and give them a character, an enduring character. And all of these, so it's like that's already a form of enlightenment in that way, like moving beyond perhaps like totem and taboo, which might be like the dimmest beginnings of this, which is still takes us beyond the animals, right? So that's why it's perhaps the dimmest beginnings of enlightenment. So already within myth, there is the project of enlightenment going. And then when we get to enlightenment, I mean, as Nietzsche says about Socrates, the theoretical way of life is a myth. That was a whole mythos that Socrates creates of the justice man being the happiest man, and rationality is the path to justice, and therefore reason equals virtue equals happiness. There's sort of like this promise of eudaimonia. There's this promise that if we like craft this ideal society, things will run more harmoniously. Uh, and so like that's always contained within enlightenment. And one of the things they talk about is like Francis Bacon, and how he basically says enlightenment is the task of binding nature to our will. That's what we're doing in science, technology, knowledge as power. So what was my point in that? Well, in the term enlightenment, you have this dual-sided character that sublates itself. Likewise in myth, right? Like when we think of myth and when we think of enlightenment, you think of those as being fundamentally opposites, but they both contain each other. And so the word concept, it confounds unequal things. And oftentimes it obscures where we might make a distinction where there's actually a unity. And why is that? Well, it's because the word concept, again, is yet another form of man taking power over something in the world, over nature, right? There's something about naming something as a concept and taking hold of it, grasping it, that then allows you to have power over it, because then it can become a factor or a variable in your equations and your formulae about reality. It's like it's like the power is the basis of conceptualization over the world. And so, what was I talking about? Oh, the tarantulas, the web spinners. So there's this way in which what they're doing with making all men equal, and what Nietzsche says in that passage on the tarantulas is men are not equal. And people take that again as a political statement, which it might well be, in like it has those implications, but it's not. Like there is a really basic metaphysical sense in which Nietzsche is saying men are not equal. That like literally people are not equal to each other. We're not all the same. Like he says the concept humanity doesn't even exist. That's an abstraction. That the differences, the variations among people are so great that it's like an absurd, it's a vulgar, it's a offensive overgeneralization that equalizes these unequal quantities to the point that it's like false. That's an error. And so that's the way in which I think the tarantulas, it's really a spider thing. It's a web spinning thing. It's the fact that Nietzsche is pointing to idealism, which idealism is the structure of modern thought. That's what comes in most strongly with Plato, and everything else. His problem is with idealism. Again, all these people talking about physics, the problem is not physics, it's metaphysics. It's the idealistic notions that people generate. It's not the empirical study of the world. Nietzsche's all for that. To get Heideggerian with it, phenomenology, go to the things themselves. That phenomena, the phenomenal world, that is being in Heidegger's reading of Nietzsche. And I think that's correct to at least some extent. Nietzsche also says being is an empty fiction, but going to the things themselves and studying the phenomena is great. It's when we make these idealistic, again, like the desire to equalize unequal quantities that happens in language and in indeed socially, politically, morally, and so on and so forth, which denies perspective. It denies all of these things about human life, different capacities, different valuations, so on and so forth. And so like there's just something about Enlightenment humanism specifically, and the egalitarianism, utilitarianism. Utilitarianism is a great example of a tarantula type ideology, because it basically makes the pain or pleasure, the suffering or enjoyment of any being that lives equal to each other. Like suffering just becomes a quantity that we can then reduce or increase. And that to me is like, that's such an obscene abstraction. As Nietzsche points out, the suffering of different individuals might actually have, like, there could be profound differences in the way that an individual experiences the same external stimulus. I'll put it like that. I mean, just on the most basic level, if you train like Jocko Willink every day, then his regiment of training is not going to represent a lot of suffering for you. Suffering for you, right? He wouldn't call it suffering. It's perhaps agony is a better word. It's part of an agon. It's a struggle with yourself, right? To overcome yourself. And the modern person only sees the agony, the suffering. It's funny that those come from the same term, like contest and suffering, in the modern sense of the word agony. But so Jocko can do that every day. But if you just plucked some ordinary person off the street and subjected them to his training routine, they might say it was more than they could handle, right? Of course, but it's the same external stimulus, it's the same input. So that's just one issue. There's like a million ways that we by quantifying pain and pleasure, like, falsify the individual peculiar experience of those things, and attempt to make it a calculable quantity so that we can, like, manage society in that way. And so that I don't know. That's a lot of what he's talking about with the tarantulas. Okay. Let's see here. Again, I've lost my place. Let's just go down to where I have the next tag. Uberboyo and Essential Salts both respect Giorgiani. I do like Giorgiani. I've heard his political ideas are a little bit fringe, but when I've heard him speak on, like, Gnostic Informant or Break the Rules, both people I've spoken to, he doesn't strike me as being far right. Like, I think part of this is just direction brained thinking that people have a problem with. That the Prometheus world that he is aimed at, I mean, in many ways, it's like the fulfillment of liberalism, in some sense, and has that Nietzschean quality to it. But what's more interesting to me about Giorgiani, honestly, is like the UFO stuff. Like, that's what I enjoy. Back in the day, I would always, when I would be driving late at night, we'd be listening to Coast AM, and so I love aliens. I love like cryptids and all of that. I don't believe in any of it. I'm very agnostic, just like I'm supremely agnostic about the question of God and metaphysical other worlds and all of these things. I'm also agnostic about aliens and ghosts and cryptids and all that. I don't believe that they exist, but I love listening to stories about it. I'm also like a huge X-Files fan and everything. So Giorgiani's whole thing about, like, these Nordic aliens and, like, ancient civilizations and all of that, it's like very much up my alley. I really enjoy it. Yeah, okay. Let's see here. I don't care, no disrespect, but Uberboyo and Essential Salts are total nobodies. Sure, but not for long. Francis Bacon, the painter, is one of my favorites. Yeah, I was talking about the other guy, Kevin Bacon. All our kids strive to be the pinnacle, yet mathematically we always form a bell curve. Interesting point, interesting point. But it's like, at the same time, that's not a how do I put this? That bell curve is still being affected by a number of factors that are determined by who and what we are. And I'll just put it like this. I mean, Uh, you could disrupt the food supply and the electrical grid in America and return us to feudal times and like watch what happens to that bell curve. Maybe it'll still eventually reform a bell curve, right? But the upper and lower ends of it are going to shift dramatically based on technology, based on how well fed everybody is, based on how much social order there is, based on even on cultural ideas and perceptions, right? So, yeah, I don't know. So yeah, I mean, people are not equal if that's what your point is. But also, it is interesting because you're pointing like there's like maybe a mathematical reality that's constant. But it's just funny because like again, the bell curve itself is a relative, like right, you have a higher and lower end, so it's a relative framework. What word am I looking for? We're gonna end the stream soon because I'll take a couple more questions, but you can tell that my brain is starting to misfire. Okay, how is the concept of will to power related to Darwinism? Man, Nietzsche's views on Darwin are they're complicated. It's not what everyone normally says that Darwin thought life forms try to preserve themselves and Nietzsche didn't. It's that it's the way that Darwin looked to epiphenomena rather than like Nietzsche thinks that will to power is in some sense more fundamental, or see, fundamental is the wrong word. It's like will to power is describing something that might describe many of the things that Darwin perceived in the natural world, like natural selection, drive to self-preservation, and so on, as well as reproduction and nourishment, these things. But I think Nietzsche would say that will to power is descriptive, is more descriptive of all of them. And I don't know. I mean, Nietzsche's not really a scientist, so take him with a grain of salt in that, his whole opposition to Darwin. I probably, you know what, I'm giving a really bad, again, as I said, my brain is starting to liquefy. So I am giving a really bad description of Nietzsche's disagreement with Darwin. I think that might be like the topic for a whole video, or maybe like a short form video, something like that, because it's a very interesting kind of like niche thing in Nietzsche is his like disagreement with Darwin. And I think in some ways he might have been like vindicated by modern science on that. Where are we? I don't know. I keep losing my place. It doesn't matter. What's your favorite topic in mathematics? I am really fascinated by supersymmetry because I don't understand it. I guess that's in physics, but like, I don't know. It's like when I listen to Eric Weinstein talk, and I've heard people say he's a charlatan or whatever, but like he gives me that indication I really love of like a whole, like I love when again opening up new vistas of perspective of like a just like something in out there in the world. These ideas I like have, it's like a new thing to me. It's novel. How do you think Nietzsche's philosophy can approach and deal with the realities of collapse, war, ecological plagues, and everything that will come and has been before? Like, how will his philosophy deal with everything, everything in the world? I mean, maybe look into the episodes on, the episodes on the political season 3, where we were talking about political philosophy. And if you listen to that whole season, you'll get a sense for what I feel. What's your opinion on veganism? Again, I kind of agree with Nietzsche. Everyone has a diet that's going to work for them. There are probably some broad overarching truths that are going to apply to most people. There's probably a certain physiology or certain type of person who can be vegan, and it's fine. I know a lot of people who have gone vegan and to get skinny and lost a lot of weight, and it seems to work for that. I also know somebody recently who was vegan for a long time, and then their doctor told them You have to eat meat now. Like you're just not, you're iron deficient. That I knew, one of my mom's colleagues was the same, was a vegan for a long time. And then she was an older lady and was basically told you have to eat meat. And, so like, I think it's, a fundamentally unnatural way to eat, but all of our diets are fundamentally unnatural in some way or another. It's again, it's a relative concern. It's a sort of a scale, right? It depends, but it's certainly not natural to eat Cheetos and a lot of the crap that people eat. Just because you eat meat, but if it's a Big Mac, that's not a natural diet either. You're still like taking in this like high caloric American junk food. So I think like in general, if you skew your diet toward natural whole foods, that's probably better for you. And then you kind of have to work out for yourself if you're able to be vegan and not have any meat or cheese or dairy. I personally don't think I don't buy the arguments for veganism morally. Obviously I wouldn't, because I'm not subscribed to this whole utilitarian idea of reducing suffering and then applying that to animal suffering. I'm just not part of that whole ideology. So that being said, I think that if you are concerned with animal suffering and like ecological destruction and everything, you should probably be aimed at sustainable farming and not at veganism, because sustainable farming is very good for the land. And it can be just as ecologically destructive if you're doing monocrop like soy GMO farming. Like that's not any better for the earth. You got to clear all that land. You're going to kill a bunch of animals to do it. So, and people have been like, at least it's very hard for me to see why you shouldn't drink milk or eat eggs or like cheese. Like we've been living with these animals for potentially tens of thousands of years, and it's a synergistic relationship. And again, that doesn't mean you should buy Tyson chicken and get your chicken from a fucking chicken concentration camp. But my parents have chickens. They get eggs from them. What's wrong with that relationship? The chickens fucking love them, and they get eggs out of it. That's how humans have been doing it for a long time. So I don't really understand the moral arguments for veganism. I think they're just like, they're attacking the wrong thing. They think it's like the consumption that's the problem. The problem is the factory farming system. You need to change that. And there would be more, like there's more of a market incentive if there's a demand for sustainable agriculture. The problem is most people can't afford that, right? That's the real issue, is that poor people get the factory farm stuff, which relies on cruelty. And that, I mean, I guess that would raise the issue. Like, is it worth having all this cruelty just to feed the masses that don't, what are they good for? Most of them are, in the words of the ancients, they're useless. Now, I don't mean that in a way of like eliminate the masses. I'm just saying we have created, like, there was a limit on the global population before we were able to produce the levels of food that we are now due to modern technology, like mainly developing like fertilizer and things like that, but also just like like modern, like technological agriculture, right? We've expanded the carrying capacity of the earth vastly. And for what? What did that get us other than this death machine of cruelty and suffering for all these animals that drives the vegans insane? So wouldn't it be better to, like, everyone's worried about population decline now. But I know that's going to cause a demographic crunch, and that's really scary. But what's the alternative? We just infinitely grow the population? Really? That's a good idea? Like, people are like, oh, the elites want to shrink the population. If I was one of them, that's what I would do. And it's actually, hey, at least they're doing it by getting you to not breed as much. If we go in full conspiracy brain, you think there's actually an elite that's trying to get people not to breed. I think it has to do with incentive structures, the conditions of modernity, and all of these things. But, you know, like, yeah, if there was a global controlling elite, the humane thing to do would be like get everyone to stop breeding as much and then transition to like more sustainable like modes of like feeding and taking care of the populace that's much smaller. And then everyone can have access to better food, that like in general, you know. Like in the long term, maybe it'll suck in the short term, but maybe in a plan that you have for like hundreds of years, eventually getting the population down. People act like this is like such a ghoulish idea. And it's like, no, the ghoulish idea is being a fucking plague of locusts on the planet that endlessly expands. And for what reason? Just to have more people? The main problem with most things on Earth these days is that there are too many people around. When people look around, they're like, why does everything suck so much? We used to have a proper country, all those memes. It's like, yeah, most of the problems are because there's just it's too crowded, right? It's like just like the beach. It's nice when there's 10 other people there. It's not nice when there's 1,000 other people at the beach. Suddenly it's like a nightmare. It's like, I don't know. I'm kind of just rambling on my own stuff, but it's just funny to me that like there's this like real aversion to the idea that we might need to, that might be smart in the long term if we're going to rationally determine how the human race should govern itself, like how we should operate, make these decisions not just by unconscious nature. That's what you're doing with the whole thing of like just let people breed like crazy. Is we're just going back to being the way that animals would behave. And that's how mass extinction events happen. It's just by breeding yourself out of control until like you know, mess everything up and destroy the ecosystem. So maybe like pull it back, gear down. I'm not saying like Ted Kaczynski. I think we need to do more technology. Technology needs to go like vastly improve. But, you know, the idea that because, you know, Japan's going to have a demographic crunch and oh my God, what will it do to their economy? It's actually not going to do much bad to their economy because they've automated a lot of their economy. Maybe that's, you know, the future. So I don't know where I was going with that. Yeah, factory farming and all that. It's basically based on the idea like expanding the population massively, and we create all this unnecessary cruelty. And that's a central contradiction at the heart of modern society, isn't it? Like I don't know. It's postures to be, we're more utilitarian than we've ever been. And yet, from a utilitarian standpoint, if we adopt that perspective, we're more evil than we've ever been. You know. All right. I think I'm done. I think I'm done with this. Thank you everybody for joining me. It's been a pleasure. It's always a nice little, you know, it's a nice little treat for me to do these live streams and just kind of shoot the breeze with all of you. Usually I'll have, you know, like I did at the beginning, a little discourse I want to give, but then to just kind of go from topic to topic. What does somebody say? Answer the Postal 2 question, coward. See, I don't know what that is. You asked, what is that, a video game? Never played it, never heard of it. Most of the things you guys asked me about, I've never heard of. Anyway, worldly thinking leads to antinatalism. See, I'm not an antinatalist. Don't put me in your stupid moral category. I'm not saying it's wrong to have kids. I'm saying think about this practically. Like, does it make sense to endlessly grow the population and expand it? No, it does not. We have a finite number of resources. So, and the innovation, the advancement of the human species doesn't just come from having more people. That's never been true. I mean, I guess, you know, yeah, if you want to look at it from a Nietzschean standpoint, yeah, you got a bigger workforce to use to enslave to your ends. But again, with automation and all that, are we really going to need that? So no, don't put me in your stupid box. I'm not an antinatalist. I think you should have kids if you want to have kids. What I'm talking about is people, I'm not talking about on your individual level of decision making, whether you want to have a kid. What I'm talking about are people on the level of social planning who will be like, yeah, we need to have more people. That makes no sense to me. Yeah, I know it's worldly thinking. Yeah, we live in the world. Do you not live in the world? Come on. Are you saying like what? We're gonna have like move to other planets? I'll believe that when I see it, man. If that's your plan. I mean, we to terraform other planets and stuff like that. then we can terraform Earth. Like, I don't understand this. Like, like, if we find a habitable planet, it's probably going to have all sorts of like microorganisms that we can't handle. That's going to be like what happened to the Native Americans on steroids. So that's not going to happen in our lifetimes. Like, if we want to get out to the stars, we probably need to chill a little bit, like in the now. We need to be like a little more practical, and a little more worldly in our thinking. So, yeah. Anyway, where's the button to like end this damn thing? Oh yeah, it's at the bottom. Okay, cool. All right, goodbye everybody. Thank you very much for joining me. I had a great time arguing with you and answering questions and doing this whole stream. Please join me. I'm going to have I think I'm going to take a week off next week, and then I'm going to have a very special episode. Some of you have maybe mentioned this person in the comments who's about to be on the show, and we might have done a fancy video podcast together in person. Well, you'll see who it is. All right, everybody. Cheers. Signing off.